I thought it would be good if we spend some time having Mike review the budget for us, and just bring you all up to date, because I know every day we read something in the newspaper that the fiscal situation in Connecticut is graver and graver and graver. So I just want Mike to be able to share information with us. At the end, we'll do a Q&A, so feel free to ask any questions. Some of you may have seen in the Hartford Current today that Middlesex Community College is going to do without their manufacturing program. They're shutting down their Meriden campus, and that is due to the budget constraints. The other piece of information that I want to share with all of you is a concern that some of you have shared with me. This morning, I wrote a letter to Dr. Gray telling him that I want the bond funding canceled for the auditorium. After looking at the operating costs for the auditorium, and given what is projected for fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 17, we really can't afford it, and it would really tie an albatross around our neck. So I just wanted to let all of you know that I made that decision today and wanted to share it with all of you. So without further ado, here comes Dean Lopez to share some exciting fiscal news with all of us. And the last thing I want to say is I hope everyone has a delightful and enjoyable spring recess, and a happy Easter and happy Passover.
Do you have any beer here? I think we need it.
Just make sure that one's off.
Maybe we need Valium instead.
Okay. And I guess you interpret the Mike's here to give some uplifting information to the Grim Reaper takes the stand again. So we're going to try and get through this as quickly as we can, folks. I have only 4 slides to share with you because I really want to use this as a question and answer session. I presented at governance last week, and I think the Q&A session was helpful to them in addressing the concerns that you have. So I want to make sure this session is for you, not for me to just stand up here and show some slides, but we want to hear what your specific concerns are, and I'll do my best to address them. Hopefully the information in some of the slides will already address some of your questions. But if not, then we'll do our best to address them. Hope to have the response for you. If I don't, I certainly will get you the information as quickly as I can. So with that said, I want to go ahead and get started. I'm going to quickly go through just to sort of set the landscape on how the funding works once again here at the Institute, so folks understand sort of what the sources and uses of the funds are. We are receiving really 2 primary streams of revenue for the college. One is considered non-operating revenue, and that's the general fund grant. The other is operating revenue that we receive from tuition and fees. We also receive some operating revenues from our auxiliary sources, and that's the bookstore commission piece as well as the cafeteria piece. Those combined, we're getting about $500,000 in revenues each year to support the Institute. So the general fund distribution, we've got what's called a budget distribution methodology, where the colleges are provided enough general fund to fully fund the general fund roster of positions that supports the instructional and student service demands of the Institute. So that is really by legislation. That is why we receive the general funds and what we're required to spend the general fund dollars on. So the general fund, again, is specifically the funding for salaried positions. We're not spending those general fund dollars on anything else other than the salaried positions. And I emphasize that because I'll talk a little bit more about different funding sources that came up as a concern at governance. There's really 3 components to our budget distribution model or methodology. The first component is really an arbitrary level of general fund dollars that each of the 12 community colleges receive. It's equivalent to about $2.15 million that really sets our foundation of funding each year. So that's the first component. Every school, regardless of the size, the FTE, etc., that is the level of funding that we're all receiving. The second component, though, is distinguished between institutions, and that is for unique funding requirements. That includes particular items like if a school has a lease. For instance, Gateway Community College has a parking garage lease that costs $1 million a year, so they are getting additional funding to address that cost that they had to incur regardless of what their student enrollment is. The other funding specifics pertain to any earmarks that any institutions may have directly from the General Assembly. For instance, if the school starting with a nursing program, they received an initial earmark for that. If a school has a manufacturing program, they received an earmark for that. So that particular school would receive that unique funding in this budget distribution. And then the third area is, in the distribution, is based on a 3-year average of student FTE. And that includes both spring and fall terms. So they would go ahead and get an average for each one of those 3 years, and then a total average for those 3 years of both those semesters to produce what the final distribution, general fund distribution, is for the colleges. For this year, going into 16, our general fund distribution is about $11.9 million, just to sort of put that in context for you. Okay. Budget timeline very quickly. We're at the point now we have submitted the initial 16 budget with an enrollment estimate of 2% down based on this year's enrollment. The President is being quite conservative. We were actually instructed by the system office to submit the initial 16 budget with a flat enrollment. I recommended to the President that we not do that, just based on what we're seeing demographically right now for the next year. I thought that was a little bit too robust, and initial indicators are that we hope that will only be at a 2% decline. There is some concerns that the enrollment could continue to decline beyond that. So we have submitted the initial 16 budget, and right now that budget, based on several factors we'll go into here in a minute, has us at a break-even budget for fiscal year 16. The rest of the timeline really for this year is we will receive updates from now until the middle of June regarding what that general fund distribution is going to be, and we'll make adjustments accordingly. The final budget will be submitted and adopted by the Board of Regents typically around the 2nd or 3rd week in June, and then the new fiscal year will commence on the 1st of July. So again, you'll see a little note that the fiscal year 16 figures are subject to change between now and then. So I just wanted to let you know sort of where we stood with the budget timeline. And I just wanted to go over a few points with the FY15 budget. Right now, fortunately, we are projected to close with a balanced budget for 15, but a couple things to keep in mind with that. The reason we are in sort of a positive position right now is based largely on the $1.2 million that we have received this year in non-recurring funding. I use the term non-recurring funding because it's truly uncertain if we're going to receive this funding in out years. And this funding was really for two sources. One was to provide a tuition subsidy, because if you remember this year, we only had a 2% tuition and fee increase, yet we had a 5% salary increase. So as a subsidy to sort of compensate for that, Three Rivers received about $430,000 as a subsidy by the system office to compensate for that inequity between our tuition increase and our salary increase. The other source of that non-recurring funding is developmental education funding, which right now we're uncertain if we're going to be receiving that piece in out years as well. So without this $1.2 million non-recurring piece this year, we were actually projecting to close in the red by about $700,000 deficit for this year. So this non-recurring piece truly put us in the black. And this is why the system is a bit concerned in out years, because much, if not all, of this non-recurring funding is in jeopardy for out year budgets. Again, the 2% tuition increase. And then the final piece, just to let you know, and I'm sure you've seen this in the past months, we were subjected to a January rescission which is included in the projected year-end budget. And we just received word yesterday of a second rescission, $500,000 rescission, and this is for all 12 community colleges, so we have not yet received our allocation for Three Rivers at this point, so I expect to get that in the next few days. And again, because of this surplus that we have from this non-recurring piece, I'm confident that we'll be able to meet the obligations of this second rescission. All right? Let me just move on to 16. Okay, and again, I'm going to open this up to questions and answers here as quickly as I can. I just want to set sort of the tone for the questions. Moving into this year, again, subject to change or next year, as you may have seen, there's a projection of about a $48 million deficit, and this is system-wide. This figure is subject to change. And a couple things to keep in mind. The first point is this figure is based on, again, as I mentioned before, flat enrollment for the system. So if the system incurs a 2 or 3% decline, this figure is projected to increase this deficit by about $8 to $10 million more than what you're seeing right now. So please keep in mind this is going to be subjected to change and most likely will change in the next few months. This trickle down relates to about $28 million for the system of community colleges, and then about $600,000, $616 I think, for Three Rivers. That's our deficit right now that they're projecting based on flat enrollment. That's not the deficit that we were projecting in the initial budget, because again, we used the 2% decline in enrollment. So in fact, our projected source of revenue, tuition revenue, is less than what the system office is telling us. So with that projection, that what I believe to be a fairly conservative projection, we were projecting about $1 million deficit for fiscal year 16 with all of the information that we know to date. All right? And that is what led the President to make a very, very hard decision, I think very thoughtful decision in looking at the non-reappointments that have been issued. And we'll talk about that. I'm sure there'll be some questions with that, but please keep in mind I'm not going to talk about any particular non-reappointment. I'm not going to get into any names or really any specifics there. But this was a very conservative, I think, defensive strategy that the President has put forward, and she really led the way with all the other community colleges in developing, I think, a very conservative, thoughtful mitigation plan for what I think will be a very, very difficult fiscal year 16. And we're already being told what will be a very difficult, maybe a more difficult fiscal year 17 next year beyond that. Just a couple other things to keep in mind too. We talked about the Food Service and Bookstore Commission. Obviously, if our enrollment declines, the auxiliary revenue that we get from the bookstore and selling food will also decline. So we will continue to watch that. We're continuing to look at expense reduction. We're always looking at generating new revenues. We're looking at additional revenues on the non-credit side of the house. We're certainly doing our best and want to see enhancements to our credit enrollment, and we're doing what we can to address that. We're certainly looking at all areas, not only of bringing new students in, but retaining the students that we have. It's just truly critical that we sustain this level of tuition revenue on the credit side. So we're certainly looking at all sources, but I think it's irresponsible if we don't also look at opportunities for additional cost reductions. Again, a lot of this hinges on and is due to the additional salary increase and fringe benefit increase that we have to meet. Regardless of what my funding source is, I have to address this 5% compensation increase. And for Three Rivers, last year it equated to, just to fund the salary increase, it equated to about $907,000. This year, with the one-year inflationary factor, it's going to come out to about $960,000 just to meet salary increases before even one student comes in the door. I have to come up with that $1 million for that salary increase. And then the additional dollars that we need for the fringe benefit expense that falls to our operating fund. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because we do, in fact, most of our, or a good portion of our over $8 million fringe expense falls to the general fund, and it is true that the comptroller picks up that piece, But there are now 24 positions in the operating fund that 2 or 3 years ago, when we talked about the initial budget cuts, we had to move some of those cuts from the general fund to the operating fund, and we did that by moving positions into the operating fund. Well, once we do that, we are now required to fund those fringe benefits from our operating fund dollars, our tuition dollars. So I just don't want folks to be confused that the comptroller is picking up the total cost of our fringe. They're picking up about $8.8 million of our cost, but our fringe expense is over $12 million. So that balance falls to the operating fund to address. So I just wanted to talk about that constraint that we have. So that is it. That is the last slide. I just wanted to paint sort of the framework that we're seeing right now. Information is literally changing every day. Again, the rescission just came in late yesterday afternoon from OPM. I don't have the allocations yet. If I had to guess, if they're looking at the same percentile allocations, the math works out to we're probably going to have to come up with another $43,000 or $44,000 to address this, our portion of the $500,000 rescission for this year. Again, that's this year. We'll have to reduce that funding accordingly. All right, and I do believe that will hopefully be the last rescission we'll see for this fiscal year by fiscal year end. So sort of good news, bad news. Good news is this year we're doing okay. Bad news is we're not going to see this recurring funding stream, or at least I shouldn't say we're not going to see it. It's uncertain at this point what portion of that non-recurring funding we may get in 16 and out years. All right, so with that, I know we're limited on time and folks have some other commitments. So again, I wanted to open it up to some questions and answers right now and give you as much time as we can here. So, anybody? Ken?
The numbers you've given us, this morning they were reporting about $180 million deficit for the current year, and I think there was like, and don't quote me on the 13 million, but $1.5 million and a potential up to, I know the governor's rescinding 13 million, I believe. I thought $1.5 million came into the higher ed.
It did, Ken. Yep, $1.5 million for the entire system. 500 of that, $500,000 for community colleges. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yep. So the balance will fall to the system office and the 4 CSUs to address.
What criteria do they use to apportion the gaps in the rescission amounts?
You mean how do they assign the $48 million initially?
No, how do they break it up between all the schools? What's their criteria?
Well, their criteria, they're looking at student enrollments. They're looking at how the budget distribution is distributing the block grant. So again, it gets back to what we talked about before in those categories. They look at what are colleges receiving as a base level of funding, and then what are their particular enrollments. And then they look at faculty workload to ensure that schools are properly funded to meet the base requirements of those instructional demands. And that's how they really look at how they're going to allocate any additional reductions accordingly. It's a good question, though. Thank you. Any other questions?
Are the proposed program directors included in the 5% salary increase?
Yes. Let me expand that a little bit. I hesitate because and I'm glad you brought that up. And I think the deans and the president, and certainly my thanks to Gail. She has been instrumental in looking and helping me and helping all of us take a look at some of this information. But we were very particular when we developed the 16 budget and the personnel plan to that. That included the 4 division directors with the proposal that's been discussed before. At the revised salary expense, the additional 5% was also added to that. So good question, Scott. So I think the personnel plan was very careful in reflecting what we hope is going to be that personnel plan for 16, and we're working very hard to address that division director piece. I think more to follow on that. Again, Dr. Gray really needs to see how this budget is going to settle out for 16. But our personnel plan right now, what we submitted for 16 includes those personnel lines for that model. It's a good question.
Can I say something about
Yes,
that?
yes, ma'am.
I just wrote to Dr. Gray asking about the searches for the division directors, and basically that is on hold until Mike and I have a meeting with him on April 21st to go through what our budget plan is for fiscal year 16. I've spoken to Ann about the fact that even if we get the go-ahead to hire division directors, given the fact that we're at the end of April, I don't think it would be wise to go forward to do a search. So what I would recommend is that the department chairs that are in place for this year be in place for next year, and we start a search in the fall for division directors, because that way I believe we will get a qualified candidate pool. Secondly, faculty will be around to interview candidates. And my real concern is if you do a search at the end of April, give 30 days, you're at the end of May, faculty are not going to be around to participate in the process. And it's critically important to me that if we move to a division director model, that we have full faculty participation. But I know that Dr. Gray has told all of the presidents that there is a no to any hiring because there's a hiring freeze on. I think we have a very good plan going forward. It remains to be seen. We'll know more when we get done with our hour-and-a-half conversation with Dr. Gray and other people at the system office on the 21st. But I just wanted to share that information with what my thinking is right now if we get the green light for the division directors.
Yes, sir.
There's speculation that that budget's not going to be finalized until arguably June and maybe into July. How late do you or can the college respond to selected reappointments or whatever if that budget is delayed?
It probably isn't going to happen until sometime in July. That's what I'm anticipating, Kent, because from everything that I'm being told, as well as talking to local legislators, there is so much that is in flux within this budget for fiscal year 16 that I doubt that we're going to know anything until probably the second week in July, which means there's going to be a real scramble in terms of finding adjuncts to fill courses. Because without knowing what that dollar amount is, and also with the mandate that we have to have a balanced budget, we've got to be very, very careful about how we monitor expenses.
And again, just a bit of a follow-on to that. The initial 16 budget that we just talked about a moment ago, we presented a balanced budget, again, based on those reductions. So that's why the president is being very conservative to see, as Ken had alluded to, this may in fact go into mid-July before we truly understand where that is really going to reside. And for us, it probably will extend into August, because I have to have some sense, we have to have some sense of where that fall enrollment is going to rest as well, and what we can anticipate with that tuition revenue. So at this point, it's just, we've developed some scenarios. We've developed it at 2%, which a 2% decline, which was what was just submitted, and then there's a scenario for a 3% decline, 4%, and 5% enrollment decline, just to give the president some sense on the landscape if in fact we have some enrollment struggles and some other potential strategies that we may have to put on the table to address that. So, Phil, I'll get right back to you.
Now, how is financial aid being impacted? Are students able to get the same amount of financial aid as before, or is that going to be cut back?
Well, 15% set aside, Phil, is based on that tuition intake, so that certainly can fluctuate accordingly. So that's a great question. Sharon?
With the CBAC agreement ending at the end of June, has there any been talk with the state unions on how any of this is going to be affecting us?
Well, for this June, the only provision in the CBAC that is expiring is the job protections provision. The full concession is going to be addressed a year from this summer. So that the job protections provision was in fact what we used to develop the mitigation strategy for 16. Okay, but the full concession, they're looking at how they're going to address that a year from now, Sharon, and the system office will be putting together a negotiating team to address that as well as the state. That's a great question. Good, Kim?
I think yesterday or the day before, Middlesex announced cancellation of certain educational programs. Is there any discussion in terms of criteria? Should that be something that we need to do here? What kind of criteria might be considered or the basis for making that decision?
I definitely think that the academic division will need to look at programs, academic programs, which programs do we keep, which programs may be programs that we do not keep, and that would be up to the academic division working with the academic dean to develop that criteria. But I think you came in after I had shared that they are closing the manufacturing. Part of it is, I know this from being at a president's meeting and being with President Washaka, the building that they're in apparently needs a lot of upgrade, as well as there's safety issues, and so that is what led to closing the manufacturing program. At this point in time, we're waiting to hear whether, if they're closing their program, will that money for manufacturing be distributed to the other colleges that have a manufacturing program? And we haven't heard anything yet on that. The other thing I mentioned, Kent, and I don't know if you were here, there's some people in the back that weren't here. I wrote a letter to Dr. Gray canceling the bonding funding for the auditorium, because the operating costs that we did for the system office were almost they were $400,000, and that's just too much to have to come up with in an already very tight budget. So I think it is the right decision for the college at this particular time. Anybody have any other questions? Yes, Donna.
In regards to the budget, I was wondering how the 4 directors are going to save us any money, and obviously, as you said, our enrollment is affected. Perhaps putting that, utilizing funds we use for directors and more with enrollment, hiring for enrollment.
Well, part of the rationale for having division directors is that we need to have directors here over 12 months. Secondly, by going to division directors, it will give an opportunity to allow more full-time faculty to be back in the classroom. And when we did the calculation, there was a cost savings to the college by moving into that particular model.
Like how much?
Right off the top of my head, I don't have that information. I'm not prepared to respond to it. And I would share this with you. I don't think I would go forward to ask Dr. Gray to hire 4 division directors if it wasn't in the best interest of the institution. And secondly, that is the model that the faculty from the election that was held believe is the appropriate model for the academic division structure.
Well, I was going to say that if maybe perhaps student services had some input on that with we have advisors, counselors there, that possibly could have assisted with the chairs, and maybe that would have been cost effective also, rather than hiring, especially since we're in the time of freeze and we're laying off, or not laying off, but possibly.
I appreciate that.
Any other questions? And again, maybe just a quick soundbite on the auditorium again. If people are wondering, that projection is based on a couple of things, just the operating expenses, the utility expenses, the cleaning expenses, as well as 2 positions that we believe would be needed in facilities, not only to address the auditorium, but to address the personnel staffing shortage that we've had within facilities for quite a number of years. So those expenses combined, we were estimating an additional cost expense to the college of $300,000 to $400,000 per year. And one question that came up with governance was, how could you afford to build it at all? And again, as some of you may understand, the construction dollars would not impact our operating fund. They were going to be targeted from a separate bond fund. But we have to be very, very sensitive and very careful once the building is built. How do we afford to keep it up, keep it clean, keep it staffed, etc.? And our estimates in this sort of budget climate, they just simply could not support that. So it was.
Will we be able to get a bond fund for future years?
For the auditorium?
Yeah.
The current bond fund is going to be canceled. So would there be an opportunity in the future if enrollment were to turn around and the school were to identify that need again, they could initiate the process again on you, but that current bond would be terminated.
I mean, the other issue that you have to take into consideration is if you look at the demographics for the next 10 years, we're not in a growth mode. And that is really very, very significant for the state of Connecticut. We have more people leaving the state of Connecticut than coming into the state of Connecticut. Plus, we have a declining number of high school graduates, which is declining by 1.6% each year. So that's a big decline.
I thought there was one more hand somewhere. No? Okay, we will certainly keep the college advised. Again, I think we're going to see probably 2 or 3 more iterations of this 16 budget before the dust settles. So we'll continue to keep everybody informed and get the information out as as quickly as we can.
The other thing is if you hear anything, either call Megan or shoot an email, because the one thing that I don't want to see happen is I don't want to see rumors, unfounded rumors get circulated around, because sometimes that's very hurtful and harmful, not only to the college, but sometimes to individuals within the college. And I know of an incident last week where someone went up to someone to say, I'm very sorry, I hear you're not going to have a position. And that wasn't at all the case, okay? I just want to assure everybody that the letters that went out, those are the letters that went out. So there is not a second list hiding in my drawer someplace. So please just be mindful of that. I think if anything, I think we need to show our care and concern for each other, because this is very hard. It's hard for those who have been notified. It's hard for those who are remaining. And it's also very difficult when you're dealing with ambiguity. And some people don't have a high tolerance for ambiguity. But that's what we're dealing with. And as Mike says, it changes day to day. I had a president's meeting last week. It's changed since that. I have a president's meeting on Monday. And it will probably change when I go to that meeting on Monday. So I think what we really want to do is try to be cheerful. We want to be optimistic. And we also have a great community here of people who care about students. And students are our #1 priority. So let's not lose that focus. And stay tuned. Mark May 8th on your calendars. That's the day that we're going to celebrate as a community. And also it's a day that I'll be invested formally as president, and I want that to be a Three Rivers Community College celebration with hopefully a picnic at noon, followed by the investiture ceremony. And some of you may say, well, where's the money coming from? The money's coming from the fact that I participated in evaluating students who applied for scholarships for Dominion in Virginia. And for doing that, I was given a stipend of money, and that stipend of money is going to the foundation to pay for the expenses for that day. So I just want everyone to know we're not using any state money, and I think what we really need is we need some sort of celebration as a community to say we're getting through this. We're not only going to get through it, but we're also going to thrive in the process. And that's going to come from innovative ideas. It's going to come from looking at what our academic programs are. It's going to come from looking at, do we need to offer any other programs? You know, I'm especially thinking in the allied health field because that's a growing field. We're not getting any younger, and as we get older, we have other needs. So I guess I look at it because I'm an optimistic person, that I think sometimes in the middle of difficulty comes opportunity, as Einstein would say. And so I think that's the way, the mentality and the rationale that we need. Okay, what are the opportunities that are at hand that maybe we haven't looked at before because money has never been a problem? So have a great day, have an enjoyable weekend, and let us know. And as Mike said, we will periodically come together so you can have this information. So, you're welcome. Take care.